Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Eerie Hour. Tonight, we're heading deep into the brutal Arctic wilderness of Alaska during the most terrifying time of the year, the polar night. We'll be exploring 10 of the most disturbing true horror stories to ever emerge from this frozen land. These accounts come straight from rangers, scientists, troopers, and isolated residents who lived through unthinkable horrors during the endless months of darkness when the sun completely disappears. Each of these stories is backed up by police reports, missing person files, and first-hand survivor testimonies that have been hidden away in government records for decades. We've gone through medical examiner files, emergency radio logs, and witness statements, all of which reveal Alaska's most chilling secrets. When the temperature falls to 60 below zero and the land is swallowed by darkness for 67 straight days, something stirs in the icy emptiness, something that refuses to be explained. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to Eerie Hour for true horror stories that will keep you awake at night. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss the moment terror comes crawling from the frozen north. Now let's journey into Alaska's endless night, where civilization fades away and the most haunting nightmares awaken from the polar darkness. Olivia Martinez had been working as a park ranger in Alaska for 7 years, but nothing in her career could have prepared her for what she faced in the winter of 2019. She was assigned to the remote Arctic research station Omega, located about 200 miles north of the Arctic Circle. The station, run by the National Weather Service and the University of Alaska, was carrying out important atmospheric research during the long polar night when the sun doesn't rise for 67 days straight. A total of 12 people lived and worked at the facility, cut off from civilization by endless tundra and deadly cold, where temperatures often dropped to minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Communication with the outside world only happened twice a day over radio, and in the middle of snowstorms, which could last weeks, there was no chance of emergency evacuation. Olivia arrived at Station Omega on November 15th, her job being to conduct wildlife checks and make sure environmental rules were followed during the research season. The station itself had 3 connected modules: the research lab, living quarters, and the utility building that held generators and communications. Since solar panels were useless during the endless night, diesel fuel was the only thing keeping them warm and alive. The first sign of trouble appeared on December 3rd during morning roll call. Dr. Sarah Chen, a glaciologist from the University of Alaska, didn't show up for breakfast. Her roommate, Dr. Rebecca Torres, explained that Chen had left during the night, saying she felt sick and wanted fresh air. But when Olivia checked her room, she found the window wide open with snow blowing inside, and Chen's heavy outdoor gear still hanging untouched. A search team quickly formed, including Olivia, Station Commander Dr. Michael Reeves, and 4 researchers. Just 100 yards from the building, under a thin layer of snow, they found Chen's body. What they saw left them in shock. Chen's body was drained of blood, her skin pale and glowing faintly under their flashlights. No wounds were visible except for 2 tiny puncture marks hidden behind her ear. Stranger still, the snow beneath her body had melted, exposing bare ground that was warm to the touch even though it was minus 40 degrees outside. There were no footprints anywhere, even though it had snowed during the night. Dr. Reeves, who had a military medic background, checked the body and confirmed Chen had been dead for hours. But her body temperature was still 98 degrees, like she had just died moments earlier. Blood tests showed her blood volume was less than 20% of normal, but no blood was found nearby. The crew brought her body back and placed it inside the utility building's refrigerated storage, which they turned into a temporary morgue. When they reported it over radio to Fairbanks, they called it a medical emergency, but kept the strange details to themselves. A massive storm was forecast, one that would soon block all communications for at least a week. That same night, Olivia was startled awake by the emergency alarm from the utility building. The alarm only went off if the building's sealed environment was breached. She rushed through the connecting tunnel and discovered the morgue door wide open. Chen's body was gone. There was no sign of forced entry, yet the electronic lock records showed it had been opened from the inside at 3:17 a.m. At the same time, every camera in the station glitched into static. 2 minutes later, everything reset back to normal, except for the missing body. Olivia searched everywhere but found nothing. All exterior doors were still locked, and the connecting hallways showed no disturbance. The next morning brought even worse news. Two more researchers were found dead in the same condition as Chen. Dr. James Morrison, the communications specialist, and Kevin Park, a graduate student, were discovered lying side by side in Morrison's lab. Both were drained of blood, with the same small puncture wounds behind their ears. The floor under their bodies was strangely warm, like heat had been generated from below. Fear quickly spread among the survivors. Dr. Reeves tried contacting Fairbanks using the emergency radio, but the storm had already cut off all communication. Though the generators were still running, the lights in the station kept flickering, making the survivors dizzy and sick. Olivia also noticed that the environmental monitors were showing impossible heat readings outside. The tundra around the station had random warm patches 30 to 40 degrees higher than the surrounding ground, and they moved in strange circles around the facility. 4 nights after Chen's death, Olivia was on patrol when she heard tapping against a window near the vehicle bay. When she looked, her blood froze. Standing outside in the snow was Dr. Chen, still wearing the thin pajamas she had died in. Her skin was pale and glowing, her eyes faintly red. She tapped slowly on the glass with one finger. When she saw Olivia, she smiled, baring long, sharp teeth that caught the light. Her lips moved silently, forming the words, "Let me in. I'm so cold." Her breath left no fog on the frozen glass. Olivia backed away in panic, but the tapping grew louder and more deliberate, echoing through the station. She woke Dr. Reeves and the others, but by the time they got there, Chen had vanished. Still, the thermal sensors showed something moving quickly around the outside of the station. That night, the tapping followed them from window to window for hours. The survivors sealed themselves inside the main lab, the most secure part of the station. Inside the emergency kit, they discovered ultraviolet sterilization lamps meant for water treatment. Dr. Reeves guessed that whatever they were facing could be hurt by UV light, the way parasites or infections are. Their guess was confirmed the next night, when all three missing bodies, Chen, Morrison, and Park, appeared outside the windows at once. Their glowing eyes stared through the glass, their veins visible under their translucent skin. They moved in eerie, fluid motions, gliding across the snow without leaving footprints. When the UV lamps were turned on, the creatures hissed and pulled back, unable to cross the barrier of light. But power was limited, and running the lights constantly would drain the generator fuel in days. The radio only spat static mixed with strange voices, like people speaking an unknown language, calling to the survivors and promising warmth if they would just open the doors. 8 days after Chen first vanished, the storm finally cleared enough for a radio signal to go out. Olivia managed to send a desperate message for help, though the response was broken and unclear. Aircraft couldn't reach them yet, so they would have to wait for ground rescue, which could take days. By then, the creatures had learned how to wait for moments when the UV lights went dark during generator refueling. They whispered through the walls in voices of family members, pretending to be loved ones calling from outside. Chen's voice spoke directly to Olivia, mimicking their old conversations with chilling perfection. While searching through the station's records, Dr. Reeves uncovered something terrifying. Station Omega had been built over an old Inupiat hunting camp that was abandoned in the 1800s. Tribal stories told of a time when the dead rose with an endless thirst. The warnings had been dismissed as myths. Beneath the station were geothermal caves that never froze, with flowing water and constant heat. Something had been buried down there, dormant for over a century, until the research station woke it. The creatures followed rules that felt disturbingly familiar. They couldn't enter buildings without being invited, and UV light burned them. But they seemed to draw strength from the long darkness itself, becoming more restless and aggressive as the polar night went on. Even worse, every time they claimed another victim, their numbers and intelligence grew. Olivia's nightmare finally ended on December 15th, when a ground team reached Station Omega. 4 survivors were rescued from the barricaded lab, exhausted but alive. 3 bodies were later recovered from the caves, though they showed none of the blood drain signs seen before. The caves were sealed in concrete, and the station was abandoned for good. Official records claim the deaths were from exposure and equipment failure during the storm. Olivia's detailed reports were locked away, and she was transferred far from Alaska. She quit the Park Service 6 months later and works now as a private security consultant in the lower states. She never accepts jobs north of the 60th parallel and has avoided every winter where the sun doesn't rise. But her nightmares never stopped, especially in winter when the long nights return and she still hears tapping on the glass, just as it echoed across that frozen nightmare in the Arctic dark. Adeline Parker had been reporting crime stories for the Fairbanks Daily Newsminer for 8 years, but nothing in her career prepared her for the winter of 2017, when the polar night settled over Alaska like a suffocating blanket. In December, Fairbanks saw only 3.5 hours of faint twilight each day, leaving nearly 20 hours of pure darkness to consume the city. It was during this long stretch of endless night that something sinister seemed to awaken in the frozen streets of Alaska's second-largest city. The first warning that something unusual was happening came on December 8th, when the Fairbanks Police Department got a call about a missing student from the University of Alaska. 22-year-old Jessica Winters had vanished after finishing her late shift at a downtown coffee shop. Her roommate reported that Jessica's car was still parked at their apartment complex, the engine running, keys in the ignition, and the driver's door wide open. That night, the temperature had fallen to minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Adeline was sent to cover what looked like an ordinary missing person case, but she felt something about it wasn't normal. Jessica was a serious pre-med student with no history of risky choices or reckless behavior. Her purse, phone, and even her heavy coat were found inside the car, meaning she had stepped out into deadly cold, wearing only her thin work sweater. No one willingly exposes themselves to such freezing conditions without protection, unless something strange forced them to. The search for Jessica quickly grew into one of the largest Fairbanks had seen, with over 200 volunteers joining, including National Guard members trained for Arctic rescues. They searched abandoned buildings, checked frozen rivers, and explored the maze-like steam tunnels that ran under downtown, carrying heat between buildings. 4 days later, Jessica's body was found in Creamer's Field Migratory Waterfowl Refuge, a bird-watching area on the edge of town. Through her contacts in the police, Adeline learned unsettling details about the discovery. Jessica had been strangled with a thin cord, yet her body showed no sign of resistance. Even more disturbing, she was completely naked, her clothing folded neatly nearby, despite the fatal cold. Exposure at those temperatures should have killed her in minutes, but her cause of death wasn't freezing. Instead, the medical examiner found she had lost nearly 40% of her blood, though no blood was found at the scene. 2 tiny puncture marks were discovered on her neck, but they didn't match any animal bite or medical tool. The mystery only deepened. Just 3 days later, another victim vanished in the exact same way. Marcus Chen, a graduate student in atmospheric sciences, disappeared while walking from the university library to his car late at night. Security footage showed him entering an elevator in the parking garage at 11:47 p.m., but he was never seen exiting. His car was later found downstairs, Engine on, driver's door open, no signs of a struggle. Adeline dug into connections between Jessica and Marcus and realized they both disappeared during the darkest hours of night. Reviewing security footage from other cases, the same strange pattern appeared. Victims walking alone would suddenly stop, look towards something off camera, and then calmly walk away into the shadows as if following someone they trusted. They didn't look afraid. They looked willing. The growing list of disappearances led Fairbanks police to create a task force with Alaska state troopers and FBI behavioral experts. Together, they tracked the timing. Every 3 to 4 days, another young adult went missing, always during the deepest night. The victims were between 18 and 25 years old, healthy, with no link other than living in Fairbanks. When Marcus's body was discovered 5 days later in the parking lot of the Westmark Fairbanks Hotel, the similarities to Jessica were chilling. He too had been strangled and drained of blood with the same puncture marks on his neck. His clothes were folded neatly nearby, and his body showed no frostbite, despite lying outside in minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit for days. The coroner said Marcus had died less than 12 hours before being found, meaning he had somehow been alive for days after he vanished. As the investigation heated up, Adeline began receiving strange anonymous tips. A taxi driver swore he saw a naked figure sprinting through downtown at 3 a.m. in below-zero temperatures, moving impossibly fast without any sign of suffering from the cold. A security guard at the university described a pale figure in the steam tunnels that vanished the moment he approached, leaving behind only a strong metallic odor, like copper mixed with old blood. The third victim, however, survived long enough to tell her story, offering vital evidence about the attacker. Sarah Thompson, a nurse at Fairbanks Memorial Hospital, was found unconscious in the parking garage on December 19. She was alive but had lost large amounts of blood from puncture wounds on her neck. Doctors discovered she had been drugged with a paralytic chemical that left her conscious but unable to move or cry out. Under hypnosis, Sarah described the chilling attack. She said the figure first seemed like a coworker and spoke in a calm, familiar voice, asking her to come closer. Though she felt something was wrong, she couldn't resist. She remembered pale skin that glowed faintly and eyes that caught light like an animal's. Then the attacker's sharp teeth sank into her neck. She felt every second of it, but couldn't scream or fight back. Toxicology tests revealed a strange compound in her blood that resembled snake venom, capable of paralyzing muscles but leaving the victim awake. The chemical broke down quickly, which explained why it was hard to detect later. Adeline's digging soon uncovered something even more terrifying. Historical records showed that Fairbanks had seen similar killings before, stretching back to the 1970s. Every 15 to 20 years, always in the darkest winters, clusters of deaths appeared with the same details. Young victims found drained of blood, puncture wounds on the neck, bodies left in freezing weather without frostbite. Then when the long nights ended, the killings would stop suddenly. FBI profilers suggested it might be someone with medical training and access to drugs, but the sheer amount of blood missing from each body didn't make sense for a single human killer. On December 22nd, the darkest day of the year, the case escalated. 4 people vanished in one night, all from different parts of Fairbanks. Their bodies were found 2 days later in Pioneer Park, arranged in a circle around the old log cabin exhibit. All had been drained completely, puncture wounds marking their necks. When investigators scanned the ground beneath them, they found the blood had been deliberately poured into the permafrost below in strange patterns, similar to ancient ceremonial sites. Archaeologists explained that Pioneer Park had been built over a traditional Athabascan ceremonial ground. Tribal elders reluctantly told investigators old stories of creatures they called ice drinkers, beings that fed on human blood during the darkest winters, emerging only when night swallowed the land. The investigation gained a breakthrough when Adeline dug through hospital work schedules. She noticed that every night a victim disappeared, the same doctor had been on duty. Dr. Robert Hayes, a third-year resident, had always requested to work overnight shifts during winter's darkest hours. Surveillance confirmed the suspicion. Hayes often left the hospital during breaks, returning with bloodstains on his clothes. His skin had turned noticeably pale, and co-workers said he avoided light, even complaining of headaches from fluorescent bulbs. When police searched his apartment, the evidence confirmed their fears. The fridge held bags of stolen hospital blood, and journals inside detailed his transformation from human to something else. Hayes wrote that he had been attacked 2 years earlier while camping in northern Alaska and survived what he called a feeding that forever changed him. He confessed in writing that he fought the hunger at first, but the polar night made it impossible to resist. Hayes explained that his saliva produced a natural paralytic chemical, the same one found in his victims, allowing him to feed without a fight. Even more disturbing, he wrote that others like him existed across Alaska, only waking when winter darkness was complete. On December 27th, police tried to arrest him after he attempted another attack in the hospital garage, but the arrest was anything but normal. Hayes showed unnatural strength, fought through injuries that should have stopped him, and tranquilizers did nothing. Only when officers used high-powered UV lights from the hospital's surgical suites did Hayes collapse, writhing in pain. During questioning, Hayes admitted there were more of his kind in Fairbanks. 4 others, all transformed in past winters, now working together to feed. They targeted people who wouldn't be missed quickly: transients, travelers, and students. Eventually, all 5 were taken into custody, but what authorities found shocked them further. They could not survive sunlight, their skin burning instantly. They needed refrigerated cells to live, and without steady transfusions of blood, they became feral and uncontrollable. Adeline's investigation uncovered that similar events had happened many times before across Alaska, but had always been buried as myth or dismissed as folklore. Yet the truth was there, waiting in the dark winters for anyone who dared to look closely enough. Government officials at both state and federal levels had long known that something unusual was happening, but instead of warning the public, they chose to hide the truth to avoid panic. Adeline's series of articles about the strange events gained her several journalism awards, yet most major outlets brushed them aside, calling them dramatic fiction. The Fairbanks Strangler case was officially closed after the 5 suspects were convicted of multiple murders, though they were kept in a special facility built to handle their unusual medical conditions. After their arrest, the string of disappearances suddenly ended, and crime rates in Fairbanks went back to normal. But Adeline's instincts told her the story was not finished. She kept following clues from other parts of Alaska and discovered reports suggesting the phenomenon was far more widespread than authorities were willing to admit. In 2018, she finally left Alaska and took a job with a major newspaper in Seattle, focusing on strange and unusual criminal cases. Still, she never cut ties with her contacts back north and kept receiving reports of similar attacks happening in remote villages during the long, dark winters. Her files grew thicker each year with accounts of bodies drained of blood, convincing her that Fairbanks had only revealed the surface of a much larger, terrifying truth that rose with the darkness each winter. That same year, another story began that would take things even further. Kilian Rodriguez had been studying the skies and atmospheric events for over a decade, but his posting to a remote weather research station in northern Alaska during the winter of 2018 would shatter everything he thought he understood about the natural world. Kilian was a senior meteorologist with the National Weather Service, and his specialty was studying the aurora borealis, the shimmering northern lights created when solar particles collided with Earth's magnetic field. The station where he worked sat 150 miles north of Fairbanks, set at the perfect latitude to capture the most powerful aurora activity during the endless polar night. The facility had top-level equipment, including magnetometers, spectrometers, and high-resolution cameras that could track the lights across a wide spectrum of energy. Killian's job was to carefully record how auroras behaved during the winter solstice, the time of year when geomagnetic activity usually peaked. The place was completely cut off from the rest of the world. The nearest town was a native village 80 miles away, only reachable by helicopter or snowmobile when the weather allowed. Contact with anyone outside relied on satellite systems that often failed during magnetic storms. Killian wasn't alone, though. He worked alongside Dr. Martha Chen, a geophysicist from the University of Alaska, and Tom Bradley, a communications technician who kept the fragile systems running. Everything was routine until December 10th, when the first odd activity began. The solar winds were quiet that night, which should have meant calm skies, yet above them, spectacular auroras erupted. Killian noticed his instruments recording something even stranger. The lights were forming much lower in the atmosphere than normal, dipping to less than 30 miles above the ground. Even their colors were wrong. Instead of greens and pale reds, the skies glowed with purples and deep crimson, wavelengths rarely seen in natural aurora activity. What unsettled Killian the most was their shapes. Instead of flowing arcs and curtains of light, the displays formed precise circles, triangles, and sharp geometric designs that looked more like written symbols than random natural movements. These weren't just natural patterns. They seemed organized. Killian started documenting everything, though his unease grew with each passing night. His spectrometer readings showed frequencies far beyond what was possible in known auroras, including extremely low levels below 20 Hz, waves known to affect the human brain, sometimes causing feelings of unease, paranoia, or even hallucinations. On December 15th, during one of the strongest displays yet, Killian stepped outside to take photographs and heard something impossible. At first, it was just static on his recording devices, but when he listened more carefully, he noticed voices. Faint, layered voices speaking together in a language he had never heard before. They weren't random sounds. The voices rose and fell in exact rhythm with the shifting shapes of the aurora above. They were connected. At first, Dr. Chen dismissed his claims, calling it a trick of the mind. But when she looked at the recorded data herself, she saw undeniable signs that something abnormal was happening. The auroras weren't just producing light. They were generating complex radio transmissions across multiple frequencies, as if they were deliberately sending out information. Killian's breakthrough came when he realized the strange language was not random at all. It followed mathematical patterns, prime numbers, geometric ratios, and constants from astronomy. The voices were speaking in the language of science itself, suggesting intelligence behind them. Someone or something was using the aurora to communicate. The messages grew more frequent and intense as the weeks passed, and Killian's obsession deepened. Despite the deadly minus 40-degree temperatures, he spent long hours outside, listening and recording. His colleagues worried about him. He looked exhausted, but he insisted he was close to a discovery that would change science forever. By December 18, the content of the voices shifted. No longer just numbers and patterns, they began sharing detailed descriptions of Earth itself. They spoke of the atmosphere, the magnetic poles, and even radiation readings more precise than any human instrument could achieve. They described conditions from places where no one had ever placed sensors, and even shared records of events thousands of years old. Ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and shifts in the magnetic poles. It was as though these voices had been watching Earth for millennia. Then the voices changed again. On December 20th, they began addressing Killian directly. They spoke his name, referenced his family, his childhood, even ideas from his private research notes that he had never shared with anyone. The intelligence behind the lights was not just watching the planet, it was watching him. They told him he could join them through a process they called atmospheric integration, a merging of consciousness with the magnetic field itself. They promised freedom from the limits of the human body and the ability to exist as pure energy, aware of the entire electromagnetic spectrum at once. Tom Bradley and Dr. Chen grew alarmed when Killian started answering them aloud, holding conversations with the lights for hours on end. He even began using the same strange mathematical patterns in his speech that appeared in the aurora signals. Dr. Chen's studies showed terrifying changes in him. His brain waves had started syncing with the frequencies of the lights, and his body no longer reacted to the freezing cold the way it should. His eyes began faintly glowing with colors identical to those in the auroras. On December 21st, the longest night of the year, the voices revealed their true identity. According to Killian, they were once human, ancient civilizations who had survived previous ice ages by transcending their physical forms. Their minds had become patterns of energy within the Earth's magnetic field, and they had been guiding humanity for centuries, nudging discoveries in science and technology. Now they wanted Killian. They had chosen him to join their collective, offering him eternal life as energy in exchange for leaving behind his body. The chance would only come once, during the solstice, when the barrier between matter and energy was weakest. On December 22nd, just after midnight, Dr. Chen and Bradley found Killian outside under the most intense aurora they had ever seen. The sky above him pulsed with sharp patterns of light, shifting in time with his heartbeat. His body itself seemed to glow faintly, his skin turning almost transparent, his blood visible as threads of light. He was speaking in the strange mathematical tongue, his voice echoing back from the lights overhead as though in direct conversation. Other voices answered, welcoming him. When Dr. Chen tried to drag him away, the moment she touched him, a violent surge of electricity knocked her back, damaging her nervous system. Bradley attempted to cut the power of the auroras with the station's field generators, but the machines burned out instantly. At the stroke of midnight, Killian's body began to dissolve. His physical form broke down, his molecules unraveling into streams of glowing energy that drifted upward into the sky. His colleagues could only watch in shock as his mind joined the vast intelligence above. The aurora pulsed so brightly it lit the entire station, then returned to normal. Through the station's radios, Killian's voice came one last time. He thanked his friends for standing by him and warned them to flee before the voices reached out to them as well. Dr. Chen and Tom Bradley abandoned the station immediately, riding snowmobiles through the frozen night until they reached the nearest village. In their reports, they described equipment failure and the toll of extreme stress, claiming Killian had wandered off into the wilderness during a storm and died of exposure. No search was mounted because of the brutal weather and remote location. Official records list Killian Rodriguez as missing, presumed dead in the frozen wastes of Alaska. The research station was permanently closed after the incident, with officials blaming the mental risks of long isolation during the endless polar night. Dr. Chen walked away from atmospheric research completely. She now teaches high school science in California and refuses to speak about what happened in Alaska. Yet researchers of the aurora all over the world have continued noticing strange geometric light patterns whenever geomagnetic activity is at its highest, especially around the winter solstice. These displays show the same impossible mathematical designs and unnatural electromagnetic readings that Killian recorded during his last days at the station. Some people even claim to hear faint voices inside the static on their radios during these aurora events. The voices don't speak in ordinary language, but in the same mathematical codes Killian had learned to understand, sending data about the sky, atmosphere, and even cosmic events with accuracy far beyond current science. Physicists who have carefully studied these signals discovered that the information seems decades ahead of what humans know today. raising the question of whether something intelligent behind these lights is still observing and tracking Earth's magnetic systems. On rare winter nights when the aurora is at its most powerful, a few observers claim to hear Killian's own voice hidden within the transmissions. He speaks about the overwhelming awareness he gained after merging his mind with the planet's magnetic field, describing Earth itself as a living electromagnetic being with its own consciousness. His words are filled with wonder, but also a chilling warning about the cost of going beyond human boundaries. The old research station still stands empty, its once advanced equipment slowly breaking down in the bitter Arctic weather. But in the darkest stretch of winter, pilots flying overhead sometimes report strange electromagnetic interference with aurora curtains rising straight from the ground around the abandoned buildings. Official reports call it nothing more than leftover effects from the station's equipment, but local native communities avoid the area completely, saying it has become a place where the barrier between the living world and the spiritual one has been permanently broken. Music. Jalen Thompson had been driving Alaska's Dalton Highway for 15 years, hauling supplies to the faraway oil stations on the North Slope during the brutal winter months when the ice roads were solid enough to carry full trucks. The 414-mile stretch between Fairbanks and Dead Horse was considered one of the most dangerous roads on Earth, a frozen artery through endless Arctic wilderness where temperatures plunged to minus 60 degrees and storms could trap drivers for days. But in December of 2016, Jalen encountered something on that road that made the deadly weather feel like a minor concern. The Dalton was hardly a road in the normal sense. For most of its distance, it was nothing more than a cleared path laid over gravel to keep the permafrost from melting. There were no gas stations, no cell service, and no guarantee of rescue if trouble struck. During the endless polar night, the route was driven only by hardened truckers carrying essential supplies. Their survival relied on skill, preparation, and an unspoken rule. You always stop to help another driver in need. Jalen's December run began like countless others. He was pulling a full load of drilling gear in his customized Kenworth W900, built specifically for Arctic runs with special heaters, oversized fuel tanks, and survival gear. The forecast called for clear skies and stable temperatures around minus 40 degrees, freezing but tolerable for seasoned drivers. His first sign that something wasn't right came at mile 175 near the Yukon River Bridge. His CB radio suddenly crackled with a distress call. The voice said it was Danny Morrison, a driver Jalen knew well, saying his truck had broken down and he needed help. Morrison claimed he was stranded 20 miles ahead near a wide pull-off area drivers often used to rest. Without hesitation, Jalen responded. The code of the road was absolute. No one gets left behind in the Arctic. But when he arrived, there was nothing. No broken truck, no tire marks, not even disturbed snow. The place was completely empty, the tundra stretching into blackness. Jalen tried calling Morrison again over the radio, but got no reply. He searched for nearly an hour, thinking maybe Morrison had given the wrong spot or slid into a ravine. The minus 45-degree cold outside could kill anyone without proper gear in minutes. Finally, Jalen called dispatch on his satellite phone to report what happened. That's when the real shock hit. The dispatcher told him Morrison wasn't even on the road. In fact, he'd been out sick for days with pneumonia and hadn't taken any runs. No Morrison truck was anywhere on the Dalton Highway. The chill that ran through Jalen wasn't from the weather. The voice on the radio had been perfect. Morrison's exact accent, his way of speaking, even small personal references only a real friend would know. Whoever was behind it knew the trucking community in detail, but their reason for luring Jalen to such an empty stretch of road was a mystery. About 20 miles further, Jalen saw something that made him doubt his own senses. A hitchhiker on the Dalton Highway. A figure stood by the road with his thumb out, wearing winter clothes but showing no struggle in the deadly cold. At first, Jalen thought he must be hallucinating, but as his headlights lit up the man, he saw a middle-aged bearded face, someone who looked like a rugged outdoorsman. Against his better judgment in company policy, Jalen slowed down. Leaving anyone outside in this environment was a death sentence, and survival in the Arctic meant looking out for others. The man climbed into the cab with a thankful smile. He said his snowmobile had broken down and he needed a ride to Coldfoot, the next stop north. He introduced himself as Frank Williams, a pipeline worker returning from a remote site. His story made sense, and he seemed to know plenty about oil work, but soon Jalen noticed details that unsettled him. Williams had no signs of frostbite or even discomfort, even though he claimed to have been stranded for hours. His winter clothes had no company markings, which was unusual for someone in the oil field, and his questions during the ride felt wrong. He kept asking about Jalen's route, cargo, and the schedules of other drivers. He seemed far too interested in remote facilities. When Jalen casually mentioned the strange fake call from Morrison, Williams suddenly grew tense. He claimed other drivers had faced similar things, but said companies covered it up. As they neared mile 235, Williams asked to be dropped off at a supposed maintenance road that wasn't on any map. Jalen saw no sign of industrial activity. When he hesitated, Williams insisted, saying co-workers would meet him there. Jalen pulled over, but as Williams reached for the door, Jalen's instincts screamed. The man's movement had changed. No longer casual but sharp and predatory. His fingernails looked longer now, sharpened to points. Alarmed, Jalen stomped the accelerator, throwing Williams back in his seat. The hitchhiker's polite mask fell away instantly. His face twisted with inhuman fury. He lunged at the steering wheel, his strength far beyond any man's, trying to force the truck off the icy road. Jalen fought to keep control, the headlights swinging wildly across the snow. And in the middle of that desperate struggle, Jalen finally saw his passenger clearly. The man's eyes reflected light like an animal's, faintly glowing. His teeth had grown into fangs. His breath reeked of blood. This was no man. Whatever Frank Williams was, he was something else entirely. He wanted the truck, and Jalen knew his life meant nothing to it. The fight dragged on for minutes that felt endless, the truck weaving at 60 miles an hour across sheer ice. Williams was monstrously strong, but clumsy with the truck's controls. That gave Jalen just enough of an edge to keep from flipping over. Then as they crested a hill, headlights appeared in the distance. Another truck. Williams froze, released the wheel, and retreated to his seat. As the southbound truck passed, Williams flung the passenger door open and jumped out, even though Jalen was still driving at 40 miles per hour. But instead of tumbling across the frozen road, the man landed smoothly in a crouch. In one blink, he was gone, vanishing into the Arctic night with terrifying speed. Shaken and terrified, Jalen pulled over and radioed the driver he had just passed, warning him. But the other driver said he saw no one by the road, no hitchhiker at all. Williams had simply disappeared. The rest of Jalen's trip to Dead Horse was eerily normal, but once he arrived, he reported everything to his company and the Alaska State Troopers. They took his account seriously given the dangers. But how do you investigate an attack from something not human? The official report called it an attempted hijacking by an unknown suspect who escaped, but the evidence told a darker story. DNA traces from the passenger seat didn't match human genetic patterns at all. They showed a twisted structure that seemed part human, part something else. Stranger still, Williams had left behind forged ID papers and photographs of other Dalton Highway drivers. Many of those drivers had been reported missing in past winters. The forgeries looked professional, but the missing faces were undeniable. Investigators soon found that all those missing truckers had last been seen traveling alone during the polar night. often after responding to mysterious radio calls or after picking up hitchhikers. The Morrison impersonation wasn't the only one. The creature had taken on the names of several missing drivers, copying their voices perfectly and even bringing up personal details that no stranger could possibly know. This level of detail suggested that whatever it had been quietly watching the trucking community for years, learning how they spoke, how they trusted one another, and how to use those survival rules against them. Jalen's account of Williams changing shape was later supported by the evidence inside his truck. The interior showed deep claw marks and bite patterns that didn't match any animal known to science. Investigators concluded that Williams had retractable claws and a mouth that could shift between human-like teeth and something far more predatory. DNA results confirmed it was unlike anything on record. The samples showed traits from multiple species, and some markers didn't match anything found on Earth. The scope of the investigation grew, stretching across 2 decades of trucking records. The pattern was clear. Winter after winter, experienced drivers traveling alone across remote Arctic routes had gone missing. Some of their trucks were discovered abandoned, but the drivers themselves were never seen again. When Canadian officials were brought in, they found the same disturbing cases on ice roads in the Northwest Territories and Yukon. The disappearances weren't isolated to Alaska. They formed a trail that looked eerily similar to the migration paths of certain Arctic animals, hinting that the predators behind them might be nomadic hunters, moving with the wilderness and feeding on humans when the darkness was deepest. Williams himself was never caught, no matter how hard they searched the area where he leapt from Jalen's truck. But his escape wasn't the end of the story. Because of the incident, Arctic trucking companies rolled out strict new safety rules. Drivers were now required to check in regularly, travel in convoys during the polar night, and use updated radio systems that made impersonations harder to pull off. Jalen never returned to the Dalton Highway during the winter again. Instead, he switched to routes farther south, where the sun provided at least some comfort from whatever thrived in the darkness. Still, the experience left its mark on him. Even years later, he struggled to drive at night without watching his mirrors constantly, and he refused to ever trust a hitchhiker or a distress call without double-checking it first. 3 years after that horrifying drive, researchers from the University of Alaska stumbled onto something that gave Jalen's story even more weight. In the frozen north, they found evidence of a previously unknown hominid species. Hair and tissue samples suggested a hybrid, part human and part Arctic predator, perhaps the result of ancient crossbreeding long before written history. The discovery was immediately classified, locked away by federal authorities, and never shared in journals. Still, word reached Jalen. Government investigators told him directly that his encounter with Williams had been real contact with a species that had been tracked in secret for decades. These beings weren't mindless beasts. They were hunters with intelligence, adapted to target isolated people who traveled the winter wilderness alone. Jalen has since become a trainer for a major trucking company, specializing in preparing drivers for extreme conditions. He never speaks of Williams in public, but he makes sure his students understand the dangers of misplaced trust. He drills them on verification, on second-guessing every unexpected radio call, and on watching for signs of predators, though most assume he means wolves or bears. They don't realize he is warning them about something far worse. The Dalton Highway still runs through the polar night, but companies no longer allow solo trips. Trucks roll together, equipped with advanced GPS trackers and systems that can't be shut off. Yet even with all these measures, reports continue. Drivers still see hitchhikers standing calmly in impossible cold, and the number of missing truckers in the winter months remains far higher than anywhere else in the industry. Music Kaizen Mitchell had worked as an Alaska state trooper for 12 years when he got the assignment that would change everything he thought he knew about the far north. In January 2019, during the heart of the polar night, Kaizen was sent to look into missing person reports from a tiny village called Kalina, 200 miles northwest of Kotzebue on the state's frozen coast. What he found there defied not only law enforcement training, but basic human logic. The case began with a satellite call from Dr. Elena Vasquez, a public health nurse who made rounds to isolated Arctic communities. She was supposed to spend 3 days in Kalina, checking on residents and updating vaccinations. But when she arrived on January 15th, flown in on a bush plane, she discovered the entire village had been abandoned. There were no signs of panic, no violence, no evacuation, just emptiness. Kalina had existed for centuries in different forms, held together by traditional hunting, fishing, and the slow addition of modern comforts like satellite communication and seasonal supply flights. Its 93 residents rarely left in the winter, bound together by necessity, which made the complete disappearance of an entire community nearly impossible. Dr. Vasquez quickly saw that the abandonment had been recent, perhaps within the last week. Meals were still set out on tables, frozen but untouched. Fires in stoves had burned out naturally, not smothered, as though people had simply stopped tending them. Personal belongings like rifles, clothes, and even valuables sat in place. The most unsettling discovery was in the food stores. Meat caches, both above and underground, had been emptied, but not in a desperate rush. The removal looked methodical, as though someone, or something, had carefully collected the supplies and taken them elsewhere. 3 days later, Kaizen and his team reached Kalina. Travel by air was impossible in the weather, so they rode snowmobiles in from Kotzebue. Alongside him were Sergeant Maria Santos, a forensic specialist, and Jake Kanguk, an experienced Inupiat guide. The temperature hit minus 52 degrees Fahrenheit, with only 2 dim hours of daylight. Their systematic search showed more signs that the villagers hadn't left by choice. Crafts sat half-finished, meals were partway prepared, clothes were laid out as if someone was about to put them on. Children's toys littered the common spaces. None of the homes had been sealed up against the Arctic elements or animals. Even stranger, the communication systems had been sabotaged. The satellite phone equipment had missing parts, not damage from weather. The backup radio was disabled in the same way. Whoever had done it knew what they were doing. The team eventually turned to the underground food storage chambers. These had been used for generations, dug into the permafrost to keep meat frozen for long periods. But what they found was not food storage. The spaces had been transformed into living quarters. Sleeping areas, makeshift furniture, and signs of habitation were everywhere. Somehow the chambers stayed warm despite the brutal cold above. And then came the discovery that chilled them most. Containers of human blood, frozen but perfectly preserved, were stacked throughout. DNA tests confirmed the blood belonged to missing villagers, but the amounts suggested collection over time, not sudden death. It looked organized, almost clinical, as if someone had been keeping these people alive long enough to drain them. The underground system went deeper than expected, far beyond what tradition called for. Narrow tunnels forced the team to crawl, leading to a sprawling network large enough to shelter dozens of people. The final breakthrough came when the team searched outside the village. Fresh snowfall revealed tracks heading inland, a long trail leading away from Kalina. The path followed traditional hunting routes, but stretched far past normal range. The sheer size of the tracks suggested the entire community had moved together, carrying supplies, tools, and gear into the wilderness at a time when no human group should have been able to travel. Following this trail meant entering terrain where GPS signals failed and navigation could only be done by traditional Arctic methods. It was clear something or someone had led the people of Kalina into the deadly polar night. The team pushed forward by snowmobile and dog sled, crossing almost 40 miles of frozen tundra before spotting strange signs of recent human life in an area that should have been completely empty during winter. The place they found was a natural dip in the tundra, shielded from harsh Arctic winds by low hills that provided both cover and protection. But the area wasn't untouched. It had been heavily altered with makeshift shelters, fire pits, and food storage, showing it had been used for some time by a large group of people. What stood out most was the lack of wildlife. Everything in the region had been hunted clean, leaving no trace of animals that should normally roam there. Kaizen realized that the missing residents of Kalina hadn't simply vanished, but had moved here instead. Though the reasons behind it were still a mystery, the move didn't look rushed. Personal belongings had been brought along carefully, and the living spaces had been built with comfort and survival in mind, as if they had planned to stay. But why they would abandon their permanent homes during the most brutal season of the year was something Kaizen couldn't understand at first. The answer began to emerge as the team uncovered evidence of a new leadership system and a strange belief that had taken hold of the community in the weeks before their disappearance. Among the evidence were journals and handwritten notes describing powerful visions experienced by some villagers during the darkest stretch of winter. These visions had promised survival and prosperity if they followed new practices that went against everything in their traditional Inupiat culture. The most shocking of these practices was the consumption of human blood, which they believed would allow them to endure the Arctic cold without relying on food or heat the way they once had. According to the writings, those who first tried this strange ritual had shown incredible tolerance to the freezing weather, which convinced others to follow. Tests done on blood samples collected from both the abandoned village and the new site revealed chemicals never seen before in medicine or nature. These compounds seemed to help blood circulate faster and increase the body's efficiency in extreme cold, which matched the claims written in the journals. Where these strange compounds came from remained a puzzle, leaving only questions about whether they were natural or something deliberately introduced. It became clear that the village's sudden transformation had not come from within alone. New people had appeared at the start of winter, presenting themselves as researchers or government workers. These outsiders displayed an unnatural ability to withstand the cold and gradually persuaded the villagers to adopt their unusual survival methods. But when Kaizen's team checked, no records showed any official projects in the Kivalina area at that time. Looking deeper, the investigators uncovered similar cases across remote Alaska, where unknown visitors showed up during the long polar nights and convinced entire villages to change their ways, often leading to disappearances. The repeating pattern hinted at a much larger plan: vulnerable communities being targeted by forces with motives no one could explain. Everything came to a breaking point when Kaizen and his team tried to reach out to the relocated villagers. Instead of welcoming help, the community had grown suspicious and hostile, treating the investigators as enemies trying to ruin their chance at survival. Some villagers even showed physical changes that backed their new beliefs. Their skin no longer reacted to the freezing air, and they moved easily in minimal clothing despite the brutal cold. When the team confronted the new leaders, they saw the terrifying truth. These figures guiding the village were not normal humans at all. They had complete immunity to frostbite, unnatural strength, and influence that seemed to control both body and mind, binding the villagers to them in a way that made leaving impossible. Negotiations collapsed quickly. When Kaizen's team tried to intervene, the situation turned violent, and normal law enforcement tactics had no effect against people with such frightening abilities. Several team members were injured, proving this had gone beyond anything ordinary police could handle. The end of the Kivalina case demanded help from multiple agencies, including federal units specializing in biological threats and psychological warfare. With their support, the community was eventually removed from the site and relocated to medical centers for treatment and study, though not all were willing to leave. Some villagers refused and vanished back into the Arctic wilderness, never to be found again. As for the mysterious outsiders who had started all of this, they escaped into the endless frozen north, leaving behind only unanswered questions. In the end, official reports described the whole incident as mass psychological manipulation combined with exposure to experimental drugs, carried out by unidentified individuals targeting isolated Arctic settlements. The supernatural parts of the case were quietly classified and erased from public files, though doctors kept treating those affected for years afterward. The village of Kievalina was left empty for good, with its people moved into other settlements across the region. Kaizen stepped down from the Alaska State Troopers just 6 months after the Kalina case, officially blaming health problems caused by extreme cold during the operation. Yet many who worked with him believed the real reason was the mental strain of facing events that shattered everything he thought he knew about survival and human limits. He moved to a warmer place, turned down every request for interviews, and never spoke publicly about what he saw. The Kalina site itself remains under federal control, sealed off under claims of environmental danger, though satellites sometimes pick up strange heat signatures in the dead of winter, suggesting activity that should not be there. Local native groups keep their distance, passing down warnings in their traditions that mark the area as cursed. Kaizen now works as a private security consultant, advising companies on safety in extreme environments. He stays in touch with federal contacts and has helped on later cases tied to vanished villages and strange cold-resistant people. His time at Kievalina left him convinced that Alaska's wilderness hides things the government would rather contain quietly than explain openly. Kyson O'Brien had been manning remote radio stations across Alaska for 8 years, but his posting to the North Slope Emergency Communications Tower in December 2020 would test everything he thought he knew about radio science and technology. The facility, called Station Alpha 7, sat 300 miles north of Fairbanks on a wind-blasted plateau, chosen for its perfect reach across the Arctic skies. During the endless polar night, when normal signals often failed under strange atmospheric pressure, Alpha 7 became a lifeline, keeping emergency services, oil workers, and scattered research posts connected when they had no other hope of communication. The tower itself was a feat of engineering, rising 200 feet above frozen ground, held steady by massive cables built to endure hurricane-force winds. Beneath it lay a fortified bunker packed with advanced radio systems, some able to cut through the aurora-distorted sky and reach across impossible distances. Kaisan's job was to monitor emergency lines, pass along messages between distant stations, and keep every machine running. The post was meant for one person at a time, with 6 weeks of food and fuel stocked inside. But resupply flights often failed for weeks in winter storms, leaving the operator to survive completely alone. The nearest town was more than 200 miles away, and the only link to the outside world was the very equipment he was guarding. The first sign of trouble came on December 8th, just 3 days after Kyson settled in. While scanning the usual emergency bands, he picked up transmissions that didn't match any official patterns. They were voices speaking clear English, but instead of asking for help or reporting disasters, they talked casually about the weather, animal sightings, and landmarks. What unsettled him most was how old-fashioned these voices sounded. They mentioned places by names that had changed decades ago, described using tools long outdated, and used radio language no one had followed in years. Stranger still, several voices claimed they were calling from stations Kaisan knew had been torn down or abandoned long ago. At first, he thought the signals were echoes bouncing off the atmosphere, replaying scraps of old broadcasts, but the messages were too clear and too relevant. They spoke about the current storm outside, the exact weather happening that night, even changes that matched reality in real time. When Kaisan tried replying with standard calls, the voices answered back instantly. They knew he was there, They responded in detail, yet nothing about their names or locations could be found in official records. One of them, calling himself Thomas Erickson, insisted he was working at a Station Baker 12, yet that facility had been demolished in 2003. No one named Erickson had ever served there, yet the man spoke like a professional, knowing radio systems and landmarks only an insider could know. The mystery deepened over the following days. More voices appeared, all claiming to be operators at remote posts across northern Alaska, sharing weather reports, equipment updates, and traffic as if they were still part of a functioning network. Their tone and skill made them indistinguishable from real broadcasts, except for one detail. The places they claimed to be working from didn't exist anymore. When Kaisan tried running voice matches against old records, the results shook him. Some of the voices matched dead operators, men and women who had died on duty years ago. The analysis wasn't vague either. It was precise, showing the same speech quirks, phrasing, and technical knowledge. It was like hearing ghosts speaking in the present. Then on December 15th, the situation turned even stranger. A supposed station called Charlie 9, from an area with no known tower, gave a weather forecast that turned out more accurate than the National Weather Service. Another Delta 4 reported aircraft movements and emergencies before they were logged by air control. But the most disturbing detail came when the voices began talking about Kaisan himself. They mentioned his years in the military, his family ties, even personal fears he had never shared. They talked about the stress of being alone, the problems with his equipment, and his doubts about what was real. They spoke like close friends who had known him all his life. They even comforted him, offering advice on how to stay calm, but their uncanny accuracy left him questioning his own mind. Were these signals from outside, or had the voices somehow burrowed into his own thoughts? By December 18, the line between reality and hallucination was slipping. The voices began predicting things around him before they happened, warning him about breakdowns, sudden weather shifts, even supply drops before the official notice reached him. Every prediction came true. Nothing in science could explain how they knew. When he tore apart the radios to check for tampering, he found nothing wrong. No hacks, no hidden devices, nothing to suggest interference. The signals were using his own systems, yet in ways that broke every known law of physics. Desperate, Kai-san dug through old records, and what he found chilled him. Hidden files revealed that operators had been reporting the same bizarre events for decades, all the way back to the 1950s. Time and again, remote stations received impossible broadcasts, dead voices returning, lost stations speaking, operators haunted until they abandoned their posts. The government's response was always the same: cover it up, shut the station down, declare it unsafe. Officially, the incidents never happened. Quietly, it became clear that certain areas of Alaska acted as strange gateways, where radio signals didn't just cross distance, but time, or maybe even dimensions. The activity grew worse during geomagnetic storms and aurora events, like the ones Kaisan was surrounded by now. By the end, the voices dropped all pretense. They told him openly that they wanted him to stay and join them. They said his skills and knowledge made him too valuable to lose, and they could keep him working the radios forever, even after his body failed. All it would take was for him to remain at Alpha 7 through the end of the polar night. The storming skies, they said, would act as a bridge, letting his consciousness shift from flesh into their world of signals and static. They described it with eerie precision, calling the station a doorway between reality and an electromagnetic realm where thought itself could live without a body. According to them, many operators before him had already made the choice. The impossible voices on the radio weren't echoes or tricks at all. They were men and women who had chosen to stay behind, alive in some strange afterlife carried forever on the airwaves. Kai-san's refusal to accept the strange offer only made the voices more determined. They tried harder to convince him, speaking of how lonely and empty normal life was compared to the endless company and purpose they claimed to provide in their strange world of signals. They promised that, in their dimension, he would never be isolated again, and his skills would always be valued. But the more they spoke, the more Kaisen realized something was wrong. Their words hinted that the change wasn't fully a choice, and that those who had gone through it lost pieces of who they once were as humans. In exchange for their ability to send voices across the airwaves, they had given up their own identity. The thought of being reduced to nothing but a signal trapped in the static horrified him. The breaking point came on December 22nd, when against all odds, a supply helicopter managed to land during a rare gap in the storms. The pilot, a veteran of many Arctic runs, quickly saw the exhaustion in Kaisen's eyes and recognized the signs of someone breaking under pressure. Even when Kaisen tried to argue that he couldn't leave his post and that the station needed him, the pilot refused to listen. He insisted Kaisen come aboard at once, pulling him away from the bunker of radios and into the safety of the helicopter. Once evacuated, doctors found Kai-san had been suffering from extreme lack of sleep and the heavy weight of long-term stress, but no signs of delusion or mental illness. He had been fully aware of what he was hearing and experiencing. After his removal, Station Alpha 7 was shut down for good. The official reports claimed the closure was due to equipment problems and inefficiency, but those who had been part of the operation knew better. The advanced radio systems were dismantled and destroyed, while the building itself was left to be swallowed by the Arctic winds. Yet pilots who flew over the frozen land during later winters swore they still picked up faint transmissions from the area, voices calling out in old communication codes as if the operators had never left. It was as though the network lived on, running itself without the need for anyone alive to guide it. Kaisen never returned to Alaska. Instead, he moved south and took a quiet job as a radio technician for a cell phone company in Texas, far removed from emergency channels or isolated posts. His work now involves simple maintenance and installations, nothing like the lonely, high-stakes operations of the North. He refuses to talk about Alpha 7, ignoring all questions and turning down every interview request about his strange experience. But those who work alongside him notice certain odd things. He has an unusual depth of knowledge about radio signals and propagation, far beyond what his current work requires. And on rare occasions, his phone rings with nothing but a hiss of static and the faintest murmur of voices, speaking in radio language that no one has officially used in decades. The Alpha 7 case remains hidden in government archives, sealed away as classified. But the strange events have not stopped. Across Alaska, at other remote facilities, operators continue to report the same eerie experiences. Conversations with voices of long-dead colleagues, help from stations that no longer exist, and whispers in the static that know too much. Again and again, those assigned to these places eventually resign, breaking under the strange weight of it all and choosing warmer climates where the nights aren't endless. The repeating patterns suggest that Alaska itself may hold rare conditions, a mix of land and atmosphere that allows signals to cross the line between life and death. Official statements still insist that these things are only the result of isolation and stress, but for those who have heard the voices firsthand, that explanation offers no comfort. Sir Music Colton Pierce had worked for the FBI for 14 years, focused on behavioral analysis and serial crimes, but nothing in his career prepared him for what he was sent to investigate next. In November 2018, he was dispatched to Utqiagvik, once called Barrow, the northernmost community in Alaska. He was there to investigate a string of ritualistic murders that began with the arrival of the polar night. What Colton uncovered in that frozen settlement went far beyond the work of a single killer. It hinted at something darker, older, and far stranger than any case he had handled before. Utqiagvik lies on the edge of the Arctic Ocean, 340 miles above the Arctic Circle, one of the most isolated places in North America. Each year, the polar night swallows the town in nearly 70 days of total darkness, a stretch that tests even the strongest minds. About 4,000 people live there, most of them Inupiat Eskimos, along with researchers, military staff, and support workers. Crime was rare in the community, which made the first discovery even more shocking. On November 18th, the body of Martha Kanguk, a respected elder and teacher of traditional crafts, was found in her home. At first, police assumed it was a burglary gone wrong, but when the medical examiner finished, the truth came out. Martha had been carefully dismembered, her organs removed and placed in precise patterns around her body. It wasn't random. It looked like ritual. The organs, heart, liver, kidneys, were arranged at exact distances that formed symbols resembling traditional Inupiat designs, but twisted into something corrupted. Worse, her skin had been carved with sharp obsidian blades into strange patterns that blended native imagery with symbols from European occult practices. Colton realized whoever did this had knowledge both of the culture and of ritual killings elsewhere. In such a small, tight-knit town, someone with that level of expertise should have stood out. Yet no one seemed suspicious. Adding to the mystery, travel in and out of the area was nearly impossible at that time of year. That meant the killer had been inside the community from the start. Just 3 days later, the second body appeared. James Agnavigak, a maintenance worker, was discovered in his apartment. The same method was used: systematic dismemberment, organs removed in the same ritual arrangement. The exactness of the cuts suggested the killer wasn't acting impulsively. This was a careful pattern being followed step by step. Even stranger, neither victim had shown signs of struggling, though both were strong enough to fight back. Toxicology reports showed no drugs. It was as if they were unable or unwilling to resist. Something unexplainable had silenced them. Colton worked with Alaska State Trooper Sergeant Lisa Tutu and local officer Robert Augak. But investigating during the polar night was difficult. The endless dark, the brutal cold, and the small-town fear made people wary of speaking out. Still, witnesses shared strange sightings. Several had seen a man who seemed native, but spoke differently, with an accent that didn't belong, and questions that dug too deeply into cultural practices, especially surrounding death. Others swore they had seen a tall, thin figure moving in the dark, wearing little protection against the deadly cold, gliding across the frozen ground with unnatural speed. They described pale skin that seemed to faintly glow in the black Arctic night. The third murder struck on November 25th, exactly a week after the first. Dr. Susan Cole, the community nurse, was found in the health clinic. Again, the same ritual, but this time something new, a clue. The clinic's security cameras had recorded part of the event. The footage showed Susan willingly opening the door for someone she seemed to recognize, letting them in without fear. What followed was hours of horror. The timestamp revealed the attack lasted more than 4 hours. Each cut and placement done slowly, with chilling precision. Evidence also showed the killer ate parts of the removed organs. Bite marks proved human, but the teeth showed unusual wear, like someone used to eating raw meat. Even more disturbing, DNA tests revealed genetic sequences that didn't match normal human patterns. The profile Colton built suggested someone with extraordinary knowledge and abilities, far beyond human limits. The careful ritual meant years of preparation. The strength and endurance required for the killings pointed to something more than human. It didn't fit any known criminal category. As fear spread, the community's elders, led by Thomas Brower, finally approached the investigators with information they had first kept quiet. They spoke of legends, ancient stories of beings called Tornaruk, evil spirits that took human form, feeding on organs, appearing during the deepest winter when the barriers between worlds were thin. According to these oral traditions, Tornaric were once humans who had been changed by forbidden rituals or by contact with dark forces. The stories matched the murders exactly, right down to the organ arrangements and the victim's strange calmness during the attacks. Colton dug deeper and found that explorers, soldiers, and missionaries had recorded similar events in Arctic communities for more than 200 years. Each report told of murders that mirrored what was happening now, the same rituals, the same strange symbols. Government files showed that federal authorities had investigated similar cases before, but every time the reports had been sealed away, explained as isolated crimes. The truth was harder to ignore. These attacks weren't isolated and they weren't new. They had been happening for centuries, returning in cycles, always under the endless Arctic night. And whatever was behind them, the pattern suggested it had never gone away. The turning point in the case came when the killer himself reached out directly to the investigators. Using the village's communication system, he sent disturbing messages that showed he knew far too much about how the FBI worked and even about classified evidence. The messages came through the village's satellite internet, and they contained details from federal criminal databases, information that should have been impossible for anyone without top security clearance to access. What made it even stranger was the way he blended modern technology with talk of ancient spiritual practices. He claimed the murders were not random acts of violence, but part of an old ritual meant to keep balance between the physical world and the spiritual one during the endless darkness of the polar night. According to his words, the organs he removed from victims were not trophies, but vital pieces for rituals that supposedly prevented something far worse from happening to the Arctic. He described himself not as a killer, but as a guardian, someone forced to make sacrifices to keep disaster away. Psychological experts analyzed these messages and found them to be far from ordinary. The killer seemed highly educated, with knowledge of anthropology, religion, and even FBI procedures. But alongside this, his writings contained strange references to entities and cosmic forces that had no connection to any known religion or scholarly text. The unsettling part was how his knowledge seemed to come from somewhere beyond ordinary human learning, almost as if he had been in direct contact with something supernatural. On December 1st, everything came to a head. The killer planned to take a fourth victim, Sarah Kapianok, a respected cultural teacher and traditional dancer in the community. He made it clear in his earlier messages that this final act was meant to complete his series of rituals. But the FBI, working hand in hand with village leaders, had studied his habits and predicted where he would strike. They placed surveillance teams in the right areas, preparing for his move. When the confrontation came, the truth shocked everyone. The killer was revealed to be Dr. Marcus Whitfield, a professor of anthropology from California, who had spent over 15 years studying Arctic communities. But the man they caught was nothing like the respected academic people remembered. His body and behavior were terrifyingly different. He fought with inhuman strength, resisting tasers and physical restraints like they were nothing. It took several officers to bring him down, and even then, he seemed unaffected by pain. Even more unsettling, he spoke details about the officers' private lives that he could not possibly have known. After his arrest, doctors discovered disturbing changes in his body. His core temperature was much lower than any normal person's, yet he showed no signs of hypothermia. Tests revealed that his body had been fueled not by ordinary food, but by consuming human organs, and it seemed this had become his main source of nutrition. His bones and muscles were altered in ways science couldn't explain, almost as though he wasn't entirely human anymore. Psychologists questioned him, and what he revealed was chilling. Whitfield claimed that 5 years earlier, while on a research trip in northern Canada, he had been chosen by something beyond human understanding. He believed this entity had fused with him, giving him immortality and supernatural powers in return for regular human sacrifices. In his mind, he wasn't a murderer. He was fulfilling a bargain to keep cosmic order intact. His attacks had been so precise, so effective, that investigators began to wonder if perhaps his claims weren't entirely delusions after all. The trial ended with his conviction for multiple murders, but holding him in prison was another challenge entirely. His body's strength and strange changes forced officials to create a special containment unit. As for the supernatural aspects of the case, those details were buried deep, hidden from the public, with official reports chalking it all up to severe psychological collapse mixed with cultural obsession. After the case, Agent Colton, who had been central in solving it, left Alaska as soon as he could. He requested to be transferred to a different FBI division, one focused on terrorism, specifically cases without supernatural links. He refused interviews, avoided all assignments in the Arctic, and never again spoke publicly about the Whitfield case. Yet his classified reports were added to a growing federal database tracking similar strange cases across the country, suggesting that Whitfield's story wasn't isolated, but part of something much larger. Back in the village of Utqiagvik, life slowly returned to normal, though elders quietly began practicing extra protective rituals during the long winter darkness, just in case. Federal agents now monitor the community more closely each year, and researchers going into Arctic regions face strict background checks. The Whitfield case remains officially classified, but law enforcement agencies across Alaska now follow new secret protocols in case similar ritual killings surface in other remote villages. Today, Whitfield sits in a maximum security prison in Colorado, where he still claims to be in contact with otherworldly beings. He continues to warn that unless sacrifices are made, more deaths will follow across the Arctic. Disturbingly, some of his predictions have already come true, pushing investigators to question whether his warnings are the ravings of a madman or proof that something far darker is at work. Amora Tanaka had worked for 9 years as a social worker with the Alaska Department of Health and Social Services, helping families in crisis. But in late 2019, she would be drawn into something far beyond anything she had ever faced. It was the height of the polar night, when the sun doesn't rise for weeks, and Amora was sent north to investigate troubling reports of children in danger near a small village called Anaktu Pass in the Brooks Range, 150 miles above the Arctic Circle. The case began after a frantic call from Rebecca Martinez, a teacher who said that several children had stopped coming to class. Their families had withdrawn from village life, and she feared something sinister was happening. According to her, the children all belonged to families who had joined a strange new religious group calling themselves the Midnight Sun Brotherhood. This group had set up camp in an abandoned mining site about 20 miles away, claiming they were there for spiritual preparation during the endless night. Anaktu Pass was a tiny Inupiat village of just 300 people, surviving through hunting and a little summer tourism. In winter, it was isolated from the world, with temperatures plunging to -40 and travel nearly impossible. Any help came only by small aircraft or dangerous snowmobile routes across frozen land. Amora began by interviewing locals, many of whom were worried about the Brotherhood. They said the group had arrived just before winter, claiming to be researchers, but their actions didn't match their story. Instead of digging for artifacts, they were building shelters and stockpiling supplies. Their leader introduced himself as Dr. Vincent Thorne, a supposed scholar of Arctic culture and religion. Yet when Amora tried to verify his degrees and background, everything looked forged. Despite that, his deep knowledge of survival skills and local traditions suggested he had been in the Arctic for far longer than he admitted. The Brotherhood drew in people who were struggling, offering them food, shelter, and promises of spiritual salvation. Families that joined were told to cut ties with outsiders and move to the abandoned mining camp. Even more troubling, children were separated from their parents for training that was kept secret. When some of those children briefly returned to the village, their behavior was unsettling, detached, cold, and oddly unbothered by the freezing temperatures. Travel to the mining site was nearly impossible at first because of storms, but eventually Amora made it there with the help of safety officers. What she found was terrifying. The Brotherhood had turned the site into a fully functioning compound, complete with underground tunnels carved into the permafrost. These weren't crude shelters, but sophisticated chambers, heated by geothermal vents and built with systems far too advanced for a small cult. It was as if they had access to resources and knowledge no one could explain. Inside, the Brotherhood lived in a strict hierarchy. New members stayed in bare dormitories, while those who advanced were given private rooms filled with comfort and luxury. At the center of it all was a sanctuary chamber, where their most secret rituals took place under Thorne's command. As Amora continued her search, she uncovered chilling evidence about what the children were being put through. They were told to forget their families, taught that parents only held them back from true salvation. They were subjected to exhaustion, strict diets, and disturbing ceremonies meant to reshape their minds. Many were underfed, yet some displayed shocking abilities, walking in the freezing cold without coats, seeing clearly in total darkness, and even reacting faster than normal. It seemed the Brotherhood was forcing them through a transformation process that defied normal human biology. Amora's deepest discovery came when she managed to sneak into the sanctuary chamber. What she saw inside confirmed her worst fears. The altar was built partly from human bones, surrounded by containers of preserved human blood. Testing of these samples later revealed DNA from missing children across Alaska. The blood had been chemically treated, suggesting that this was more than ritual. It was scientific. Documents revealed the Brotherhood's true purpose: to turn selected members into immortal beings who could survive Arctic winters without food or heat, sustained only by blood. Children were considered the best candidates because of their adaptability and purity. The process combined ritual with science, blending vampire folklore with modern manipulation. Their ultimate goal was a permanent community of superhuman survivors thriving in places where normal people could not. For them, the endless darkness of the polar night wasn't a curse. It was the key to their transformation. The entire situation turned into a dangerous mix of manipulation and belief, where people's need for survival was twisted into blind faith. Things reached their most critical point when Amora uncovered that the Brotherhood was planning a massive transformation ritual set for the winter solstice. That night, when the darkness would be at its absolute peak, was believed by them to be the perfect time for supernatural power. The ceremony involved turning every adult member and certain chosen children into something more than human through drinking blood and enduring extreme freezing conditions that would normally kill anyone. Those who succeeded would live forever as something beyond human, but those who failed would simply die, and their bodies would be used as resources for later rituals. Because of how far things had gone, federal forces had to step in. The compound was too fortified and too well armed for local authorities to handle, forcing the FBI's hostage rescue team and the Alaska National Guard to carry out a coordinated strike just 3 days before the ceremony. The weather made everything harder, but the cult's refusal to surrender made it even worse, as many were ready to die rather than abandon their beliefs. When the raid finally happened, the agents discovered that some members had already begun partial transformations. These people were frightening to face. They fought harder and stronger than normal humans should, shrugging off injuries and surviving in conditions that should have crippled them. Their desperation made it clear they thought capture meant eternal damnation. At the heart of it all was Dr. Thorne, found inside the sanctuary chamber. He was caught in the middle of transforming himself. His body showed shocking changes. He survived blood loss that should have killed him, and his organs were altered to live off blood as food. His bones and muscles had shifted too, making him stronger and more durable than before. Once the surviving children were rescued, doctors realized just how deeply the Brotherhood had affected them. Some kids had strange new tolerances to cold, while others had unusual dietary changes, meaning their bodies no longer worked quite the same as normal. On top of that, years of therapy would be needed to heal their mental scars, as many suffered from detachment and broken trust after the intense manipulation. Official files about what happened at Chandalar mining camp were carefully rewritten. The Brotherhood was described publicly as nothing more than a criminal group guilty of fraud and child endangerment. Anything tied to the supernatural was erased from reports and hidden away in classified records. Thorne himself faced multiple federal convictions, kidnapping, child abuse, and more. But because of his strange condition, he had to be locked away in a special facility built to contain someone with unnatural physical needs. Amora, shaken by the entire ordeal, left Alaska immediately after the case ended. She moved to a warmer part of the country, where she continued her career in child protection, now specializing in cases involving cults and manipulative religious groups. She helped federal agents in other investigations, but refused to ever speak openly about the supernatural elements of what she had seen. Still, her knowledge of how cults recruit untrapped families became part of national training programs to protect isolated communities. The Chandalar site itself remains sealed by federal control. Publicly, officials claim it is closed due to mining contamination, but satellite images tell a different story. Thermal readings show unexplained heat signatures in winter, suggesting that some form of activity still happens there, despite claims of permanent abandonment. Among the local native groups, the site has now become part of oral warnings, spoken of as spiritually dangerous. Elders tell younger generations never to go near it, especially during the polar night, when they believe darkness makes the land more vulnerable to forces that ordinary humans cannot see. The Brotherhood's teachings did not die there either. Similar groups with nearly identical beliefs have started appearing in Alaska and northern Canada. They mix Arctic survival with promises of supernatural transformation, and federal agents now keep watch over these movements, fearful of history repeating itself. Investigations show that the brutal isolation of the polar night makes people more likely to fall prey to such leaders who exploit both fear and hope. New surveillance and intervention systems have since been developed to stop these groups before they can build strongholds or carry out ceremonies that put lives in danger. Aviana Reed had been a wildlife biologist with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game for over a decade when she accepted what appeared to be a simple assignment: tracking caribou during the winter of 2020. Her posting was Station Echo 3, a small research base in the far reaches of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, about 200 miles from Fairbanks and 50 miles from the closest settlement. At first, it seemed like another routine mission, but what Aviana experienced in the endless darkness of the polar night would shake her understanding of science and force her to question whether the boundaries between nature and the supernatural were truly separate. The Arctic Refuge stretched across nearly 19 million acres of untouched wilderness, one of the last pure landscapes left on the continent. In winter, it was swallowed by night for more than 60 days, the cold so intense it dropped below minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Echo 3 was made up of just 3 insulated buildings, enough to store equipment and keep researchers alive in brutal conditions. Aviana's work focused on the massive porcupine caribou herd, over 200,000 animals moving between Alaska and Canada along migration paths thousands of years old. Her research meant monitoring collars on the animals, carrying out aerial surveys when the weather allowed, and recording feeding and habitat changes through the harshest part of the year. Isolation at the camp was total, with only weekly satellite phone calls and an emergency radio link to Fairbanks, keeping her connected to the outside world. Then only 3 days after her arrival, something strange happened. On December 5th, while she was outside checking equipment, she heard something in the frozen wind. Voices. They were faint, carried across the dark tundra, but they weren't random sounds. These were shaped like conversations, with tone and rhythm, as though people were talking nearby. At first, she dismissed it as her mind playing tricks, something known as auditory pareidolia, where isolation and stress cause the brain to imagine patterns in meaningless noise. But the voices didn't go away. They came back on different days, under different weather, and no matter how she tried to explain it, they persisted. That persistence made it impossible for her to dismiss them as just the wind. The voices seemed to come from all around the camp, shifting from one direction to another, giving the impression of several people moving across the frozen wilderness. What made it truly disturbing was the tone of the voices. The words were never fully clear because of the wind and distance, but the sound carried emotions of fear and urgency, like people crying out for help or warning her of something unseen. These strange calls always came during the blackest hours of the night, when the camp's artificial lights barely pushed back the darkness. Aviana tried to find the source using night vision scopes and thermal cameras, but no matter how carefully she searched, there were no signs of movement or heat anywhere on the tundra. The land looked empty and lifeless. Still, the voices grew louder, closer, and more frequent, creating an impossible clash between what her ears heard and what her eyes and equipment showed. The more it went on, the harder it became for her to focus on her scientific work. On December 10th, things took a darker turn when the voices finally became clear enough for her to recognize individual words. What struck her with terror was the fact that they were speaking in English, not in any native dialect she might have expected from local people. The voices were calling out names, repeating them with desperation: Sarah, Michael, David, like loved ones searching for companions lost in the wilderness. Curiosity pushed Aviana to look into those names, and what she uncovered was chilling. Sarah Mackenzie had been a biologist who vanished during a research trip in 1987. Michael Torres was a supply pilot who disappeared in 1994. David Chen was a young research assistant who froze to death after being separated from his group in 2003. The voices were crying out for people long dead or missing, names carved into the tragic history of the refuge itself. The effect on Aviana's mind was devastating. She could not decide if she was experiencing a supernatural phenomenon or if the endless dark, the isolation, and the freezing conditions were breaking her mind, twisting her senses into creating ghosts from old tragedies. She thought about using the medical supplies kept at the station, antipsychotic pills meant for isolation-induced breakdowns. But she knew doing so might cloud her thinking and endanger her survival. Determined to prove it real, she tried to capture the voices with specialized audio gear. The recordings, when played back, only contained the sound of the Arctic wind. But while listening, Aviana still heard the same desperate cries woven into the silence. To her ears, they were there, but the machines refused to acknowledge them. It was as if the voices existed only for human perception and nothing else. On December 15, the haunting reached its peak. The voices stopped being distant and started calling her by name. Not just her first name, her full name. They spoke of her education, her research projects, her family, even colleagues she had worked with. They knew details no one out here could possibly know. The shift was terrifying, yet strangely comforting too, because the messages they gave her often contained warnings, reminders, and even useful survival tips. They told her about equipment faults before they happened, guided her with advice on handling extreme conditions, and strangely enough, they were always correct. Whoever or whatever was speaking seemed genuinely concerned for her survival, but their guidance came with a request. They wanted her to leave the safety of the station and travel out onto the tundra. They gave her precise coordinates, promising discoveries, new wildlife species, hidden archaeological remains, breakthroughs that would make her career. The temptation was overwhelming, but she knew stepping into that endless black void could easily cost her life. The truth revealed itself when Aviana stumbled across old, hidden government files. Using her research access, she found classified reports describing similar events at other Arctic stations. Scientists in isolated conditions had reported hearing voices, starting faint and distant, then becoming personal, clear, and even instructive. These were not dismissed as simple hallucinations. The records suggested that in certain parts of the Arctic, unique environmental conditions allowed for something far stranger: communication across time, space, or even dimensions. The theory was that the consciousness of people who had died here could survive as patterns of energy, carried by the Earth's magnetic fields and influenced by aurora activity during the endless polar night. Scientific models even propose that under the right mix of cold, radiation, and isolation, the human mind could remain intact after death, lingering in the landscape as organized energy instead of fading away. Everything came to a breaking point on December 18. The voices no longer hinted but begged her directly to join them. They explained that her skills, her training, and her mind were valuable to their collective. They claimed she could abandon her physical body, let the cold finish the separation, and exist as they did, free of human limitations, free to study the Arctic forever from a perspective no living scientist could imagine. They described it as the next stage of scientific evolution, a transformation past biology itself. They told her others had done it, that those who were lost had not really vanished, but had joined this strange eternal research community. Aviana was torn between her curiosity and her will to survive. She knew that walking into the ice meant death, but part of her wondered if it really was death, or something more. Her ordeal ended when search and rescue teams arrived on December 20th, after she missed her scheduled communications. They found her shaken, mentally exhausted, but alive. Doctors diagnosed her with severe stress from isolation, but none of her recordings, equipment, or medical checks explained the voices. Her gear was flawless, yet electromagnetic readings at the site showed anomalies that matched theories of energy-based consciousness. The station was permanently shut down, the official reason given as psychological risks of polar night isolation. Her equipment was removed for study, but no answers were ever made public. Aviana left Alaska for good and now works with wildlife conservation in the Pacific Northwest, far from endless darkness. She refuses to speak publicly about what happened, though she has quietly advised agencies investigating similar cases in the Arctic. The camp where she stayed remains under strict government watch, access barred under claims of research violations. Yet pilots flying overhead still report hearing faint voices carried on the wind, particularly near places where past researchers died or went missing. The strange phenomenon has appeared in other Arctic locations too, repeating the same chilling pattern. Officials stick to the story of isolation-driven hallucinations, but researchers whisper about something far stranger, that in the frozen emptiness of the North, consciousness itself does not die, but lingers, reaching out to those who dare to listen. Vehicles were still running in driveways, hinting that whatever had made people leave happened so suddenly they didn't even bother turning them off. The sense of urgency was clear. Something had scared the entire town into leaving without their usual caution. At the small village medical clinic, where Dr. Chen had planned her inspection, things looked like everyone had just stepped out in a hurry. Machines were still running, papers and patient files were scattered across the tables, and half-finished work sat abandoned. What unsettled Oakland the most were the bloodstains on the floors and equipment, far too much to be minor injuries. It looked as though patients had suffered heavy bleeding or worse, and whatever caused it happened very recently. Around 10:30 p.m., the lunar eclipse began, casting the empty village under a strange red glow. The familiar Arctic landscape suddenly looked alien, twisted, and dangerous in the blood-colored light. Details invisible in darkness became visible, drag marks leading away from houses toward the edges of town. It looked like people had been pulled or had gone willingly, leaving clear trails in the snow heading toward areas no one should be walking to in winter's brutal cold. Oakland followed the tracks for nearly 2 miles until she stumbled upon a shocking sight. Nearly 3,000 residents of Point Barrow had gathered together in a natural hollow in the tundra, sheltered only slightly from the deadly winds. But this wasn't an ordinary evacuation. The villagers were arranged in organized circles around a strange icy altar in the center, where a disturbing ritual was unfolding beneath the blood-red moon. The altar was built from ice and stone, surrounded by containers filled with a dark liquid that Oakland realized, with horror, was human blood. On the ice lay several motionless people, including children, while others worked around them. At first it looked like doctors performing treatments, but Oakland quickly understood they weren't treating anyone. They were extracting blood. The blood was then collected and shared among the villagers, who drank it openly. The most terrifying part was not the ritual itself, but that the participants seemed unaffected by the lethal cold. The air was minus 45 degrees Fahrenheit, with a wind chill capable of killing in minutes, yet many of them wore only thin clothing. They showed no frostbite, no shivering. Somehow they were surviving conditions no normal human could endure. By 11:47 p.m., the eclipse had reached its peak. The deep red light drenched everything in nightmare color, and under it the villagers changed even further. Their movements became unnaturally fast, their strength far beyond human. Oakland realized the eclipse wasn't just a backdrop. It was triggering something in them, altering their bodies and minds in real time. As she crept closer, trying to stay hidden, several of them turned their heads toward her. They shouldn't have been able to detect her, but they did. Within seconds, they began to move toward her position with terrifying speed. But instead of attacking, they seemed curious, almost welcoming. When they spoke, their voices were familiar, the same accents she had known for years from the Inupi community. But their words chilled her. The ritual, they explained, was not a cult practice or madness. It was survival. Drinking blood, they said, protected them from the cold, allowed them to endure the endless nights without fuel, food, or heat. They described it as ancient knowledge passed down for centuries, hidden from outsiders who would never understand. According to them, Dr. Chen had arrived as planned, but instead of investigating, she had joined them. She had embraced the ritual, accepted the transformation, and was now among them. Changed so much that Oakland might not even recognize her. The strange symptoms that had brought the CDC investigation suddenly made sense. The anemia came from blood loss, the light sensitivity was because of their sharpened night vision, and their unusual diets were because their bodies now had different needs. But the villagers insisted these weren't illnesses. They were improvements, gifts that allowed them to survive the Arctic's cruelty without relying on fragile systems like heating, supply chains, or medicine. To them, the transformation was the only way forward. As the eclipse slowly faded and the moonlight returned to normal, the frenzy subsided. People began to drift back toward the village, but many remained changed, skin pale and almost glowing in the dark, eyes glinting like an animal's in the night. Oakland, shaken but alive, managed to retreat. Several villagers approached her kindly, not to harm her, but to invite her to join them. They told her that, with her skills as a pilot, she could be a valuable part of their community, especially if she accepted the transformation. She would be immune to cold, able to fly in conditions no human pilot could survive, and even gain unnatural navigation abilities. But the process required her to willingly take part in the blood ritual, especially during a lunar eclipse like this one. If she refused now, she might not get another chance for years. The temptation was real, practical even. To fly in the Arctic without fear of frostbite or mechanical failure could make her unmatched. But Oakland knew the cost. To join them meant giving up her humanity, changing in ways she could never reverse. The benefits weren't enough to outweigh the thought of becoming something other than herself. And so, she chose to leave. As the eclipse ended, she walked back to her aircraft. The villagers followed but didn't stop her, though they warned her. Without transformation, she would one day fail against the Arctic. They claimed she would eventually realize the truth, that adaptation was the only way to endure what was coming. Her flight back to Fairbanks was quiet, but strange. Her instruments showed interference patterns, like magnetic anomalies, though no auroras were visible. The readings didn't match any known natural cause. Something about the ritual, or the eclipse itself, had left an invisible trace in the air. Officially, the Point Barrow incident was explained as a temporary evacuation caused by a power plant failure. The people, they said, were relocated to shelters until it was fixed. Dr. Chen, according to records, had her investigation canceled and was reassigned elsewhere. The strange symptoms were written off as malnutrition, a common issue in remote Arctic villages. Oakland, however, knew better. She continues her flights across Alaska, but never again accepts jobs to Point Barrow or the far north. She filed her report with aviation authorities, but they dismissed it under classified categories, blocking her from pursuing it further. She added new safety gear and backup systems to her aircraft, determined to avoid ever being stranded in such a situation again. Of camping and fishing throughout different areas, my family had suggested my dad had been born and raised in a small town outside of Anaj and grew up hunting and backpacking across the entire state for most of his youth. Growing up hearing all the amazing stories, it seemed natural to plan a trip of my own to go back out and see everything my dad always talked about. It was a pretty basic trip. I consider myself an experienced outdoorsman, but I also knew better than to underestimate the Alaskan bush. I didn't take a plane deep into the wilderness or wander too far off the grid. Instead, I stayed in areas known for campers and fishermen. I drove some back roads to give myself a little more distance from others, but I was still within a mile or two of the next camp. I found a nice inlet along a river my dad once told me was an excellent fishing spot. I guess things had changed in the last 30 years, because I didn't get a single bite the whole first day. There wasn't anyone else around, but I could tell people had passed through before. Bottle caps, bits of plastic, scraps of trash. Nothing major, but enough to prove I wasn't the first. I wandered upstream for a couple of miles and found deeper pools where I could actually see fish, but strangely, I still didn't get a single bite. I switched up my fly setup again and again, with no luck. Just when I was starting to think I was doing something wrong, I saw the fish suddenly act insane. They went completely frantic and scattered in every direction. That struck me as odd because fish usually all dart in the same direction when spooked by shadows or movement above the water. This wasn't like that. Some swam upstream, others downstream. A few even shot straight out of the water, like something invisible had jolted them. It looked almost like they'd been hit with an electric shock. I couldn't make sense of it, so I brushed it off as bad luck and kept moving upstream. By evening, I managed to catch a few and had enough for dinner. The forest thinned out into a wide meadow where the water broke into different streams. I took my time here, checking my gear, fishing a little more, and just soaking in the view. The sun poked through the clouds, warming everything, and for a moment it felt peaceful. But then I heard this strange buzzing noise. At first I thought it was just my ears ringing, because it stopped almost immediately. Yet over the next hour, I kept hearing it off and on, never long, always fading quickly. I thought maybe it was a quad bike or dirt bike somewhere in the valley, though it sounded at least 5 or 6 miles away. Eventually, I let it slip from my mind and focused on hiking and fishing before daylight started to fade. Later that afternoon, while heading back downstream, I thought I caught sight of someone moving along the far bank, slipping between the trees. I froze, waiting for them to step back out. Being in a new area, I figured saying hello would be smart, maybe even swap tips on good fishing spots. But no one came out. I scanned back and forth, even moved a little for a better view. The silence began to feel strange. Why would someone hide? I called out, "Hello," but got nothing. Uneasy, I decided to head back quickly, constantly checking over my shoulder for another mile or so. Nothing showed up. I told myself maybe it was just branches, shadows, or even a curious animal. Still, when I reached a bend in the river, I hid in the brush and looked back along the path. That's when I saw him again. A man, maybe a quarter mile back, moving carefully, quietly, almost like he was trained not to make noise. Watching him, I realized he hadn't noticed me yet. Then suddenly he looked up, saw me, waved casually, and slipped into the trees. My stomach sank. What was that? From the distance, he looked almost paramilitary, like he had a tactical vest or chest rig. Maybe he was just a photographer with gear, or maybe something else. I tried not to overthink it, picked up my pace, and left him behind. The rest of the afternoon passed in calm. I cooked my fish with garlic and butter, ate under the stars, and imagined my father having nights like this years ago. It felt special to share the same experience. Tired, I settled into my tent, the fire still glowing outside. The crackle lulled me until I drifted off. I don't know what woke me, but suddenly I was wide awake. My instincts screamed something was off. Even with my eyes closed, I could sense it, light filtering through my eyelids. My first thought, the guy from the river was outside my tent with a flashlight. I shot my eyes open, but no one was there. My tent was still zipped. The coals from my fire glowed faintly, telling me it was around midnight. Then I noticed something else. About 15 feet away in the trees was a beam of light. Not headlights, not a lantern. This light was shooting straight down from the sky, a solid column about 40 feet tall. I just stared, unable to believe it was real. Aliens? No way. But what else could it be? Moments later, it vanished. The forest was dark again. I always carry a gun in the wilderness, and on this trip, I had a Smith & Wesson 10mm for bear country. I reached for it, and the second I touched it, the light came back, this time directly over my campsite. A glowing pillar, maybe 20 feet wide, pure white and blinding. I froze, realizing how powerless I was even with the pistol in my waistband. Heart pounding, I forced myself to dress, boots and jacket on, gun in hand. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The light was so bright I couldn't see the source, but it hovered silently above me, steady and unmoving. Then came the buzzing sound again, louder this time, almost right overhead. And just like that, the light went out. I bolted into the trees without thinking. Branches tore at my face and arms, but I didn't care. I spotted a hill with a dead oak tree and scrambled up its branches, climbing 15 feet off the ground. From there, I could see my camp below, the flap of my tent open, the beam of light flashing back on. It hovered, scanning, then started moving slowly, following the path I had just taken. My chest tightened. It was tracking me. I gripped my pistol, ready to fire if it found me. The light blinked off again, but the buzzing drew closer, circling. At one point, it even passed above me, the sound rattling my bones. I held my breath, praying it wouldn't notice me in the tree. Then, just when I thought the night couldn't get worse, I heard a voice. It called out, "Hello!" the same way I had shouted by the river earlier. Only this wasn't me. Someone or something was repeating my voice back at me. My blood ran cold. I stayed hidden in the oak until dawn, clinging to the branches, exhausted and shaking. When the first light touched the sky, I climbed down and sprinted back to camp. Everything was still there. My truck, my gear, untouched. I collapsed into my sleeping bag, freezing from being outside all night, but grateful nothing had grabbed me. The rest of the trip was uneventful. I spoke to a family camping nearby. They hadn't seen any strange lights, but they admitted they sometimes heard the same buzzing noise in the afternoons. No answers, though. When I got home, I told my father. He was stumped, suggested maybe some kind of military drill, though why they would target a lone camper with a gun was anyone's guess. Years later, I met a guy who told me about something almost identical. He was camping in the Four Corners area when his campsite lit up the same way mine had. He didn't run. He stayed in place until it disappeared. The next day, he reported it to the forest rangers. They told him it was likely law enforcement using drones to spot illegal grow operations at night, and they had probably mistaken his camp for one. He and I compared details, and it matched. The buzzing, the light, the way it moved. But what haunts me is the timing. My experience was in the late 90s, deep in the Alaskan wilderness. Who had drones out there back then? Civilian or government, I'll never know. What I do know is they scared the life out of me, and part of me still wonders if somewhere, someone has photos of me from that night.